NVIDIA and CD Projekt Red really want people to know about the new Cyberpunk updates and DLSS 3.5, and in fact, they want people to know about it so much that they had at least 4 different embargoes for various types of information surrounding this. It's like a way worse version of an unboxing embargo. The first was a coverage embargo to tell everyone that there are embargoes. The second was for reviews of Phantom Liberty, but only using screenshots and B-roll from CDPR or self-captured screenshots. This particularly over-controlling marketing move could be circumvented by screenshotting at a rate of 60 FPS and then rendering them in sequence. They then had one for today, which is Cyberpunk 2.0, where we can actually provide something useful rather than pure marketing using first-party materials. Then there's another for Phantom Liberty later. We are able to use our own materials for this particular embargo lift, and we're going to be talking about the real technology behind all this. So, what interests us here is Ray Reconstruction. This is a new feature that was debuted with NVIDIA's DLSS 3.5, and Cyberpunk 2.0 is kind of a combination of all of the updates to date. And if you haven't played Cyberpunk, or maybe you haven't played it since launch, and you're waiting for a time to jump back in when it's been mostly patched for the major bugs and is kind of into a good state, this is probably the time to reevaluate if you want to play the game, because 2.0 is a major change and Phantom Liberty is coming up. So the timing's good for anyone interested in the game itself. For our part, we're going to talk about how Ray Reconstruction works and what it is at a base level. We'll have some visual comparisons with it on versus off, and we're going to have some light benchmarks, as in lightweight, not just literally light, because Ray Reconstruction has some big influence in certain areas of the game, especially on how the light looks when you interact with the environment and the light sources. So it's pretty interesting. This is a major addition to ray tracing features, and let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Thermaltake Swappable Blade Fans, available in 120 and 140mm sizes. The new Thermaltake fans include 3 sets of swappable blades, so that even as you change builds or cases, you can ensure the LEDs are always presented on their best side. The swappable blades allow builders to get the fan frame out of the way of the lights by reversing the blade direction to reconfigure the fan as push or pull, while keeping the struts relatively hidden, and keeping the fan frame oriented one way. Swapping blades is done by applying pressure evenly to opposite sides, then pressing until the click. Each fan also has pin-to-pad connections for cableless daisy chaining, and you can learn more at the link in the description below. So to set the framing and the stage for what this content's doing today, our goal here is just to focus on the Ray Reconstruction aspect of DLSS. DLSS is already an existing technology. We've looked at it a couple of times now, including recently in our last Cyberpunk piece with RT Overdrive, and then most recently in Starfield when we modded the game to add frame generation. So if you're interested specifically in frame generation or DLSS in general, you should check those pieces because they're sort of foundational, but technically separate from Ray Reconstruction that we're looking at today, which is the new one. So as we get into this, we'll start with an explainer. DLSS 3.5 essentially just means Ray Reconstruction. NVIDIA has a helpful table for the different versions of DLSS and what cards they're supported on. There are different features. For example, frame generation is supported on the RTX 40 series. Ray Reconstruction technically works on everything, or at least everything with RTX in front of it. Now, ray traced lighting works by casting rays from the camera, letting them bounce around to find light sources, and then working backwards to see what light should return to the viewer. We've covered that topic before. You can watch our interview with Intel's Tom Peterson back when he was NVIDIA's Tom Peterson for more detail. Now, working backwards simplifies this process because what it does is it means only dealing with light that actually reaches the camera with a finite number of bounces, which is also helpful for performance. And that's still a ton of computation to do in real time, which is why we've seen this emergence of DLSS and FSR and XeSS. Therefore, only a few rays are cast per pixel per frame in games. For example, Portal RTX casts about 25 rays per pixel with a maximum of 8 bounces, according to NVIDIA directly. As the rays scatter over the scene, the result is an inconsistent dusting of individual samples of light returned to the camera, and they may not always be the same ones. The gaps are filled in with denoisers, averaging data both spatially, between pixels in a single frame, and temporally, with pixels from past frames. If the denoising doesn't work well, either through a lack of samples or tuning, it can lead to sparkling, shimmering, or boiling effects. According to NVIDIA, denoisers are currently, quote, manually tuned and processed for each type of ray traced lighting present in a scene. NVIDIA is in an interesting position here, where it suddenly has to point out all of the flaws and failings of RT denoising in Cyberpunk 2077, its flagship game for DLSS and RT, in order to highlight the advantages of its new technologies. The main examples that NVIDIA directly provided were ghosting, as lighting data is incorrectly retained from previous frames, and lower quality RT effects, as a lack of data leads to detailed shadows and reflections getting smudged out. These shortcomings apply to other RT games as well, depending on how the denoisers are tuned. This is where Ray Reconstruction is supposed to come in. This is theoretically a no downsides upgrade that fully replaces existing denoisers with what NVIDIA calls a, quote, NVIDIA supercomputer trained AI network. If that sounds like an extension of DLSS upscaling, that's because it is. NVIDIA told us that, quote, Ray Reconstruction is a combined AI model with super resolution. Taking Ray samples and motion vectors as input, it intelligently predicts and outputs fully lit frames as opposed to applying a blanket algorithm. According to NVIDIA, the model is being trained to, quote, be able to handle all types of content and doesn't require a return to game-specific training like in the past. Although we at GN can only speak for Cyberpunk 2077 today for Ray Reconstruction. Here's the breakdown for Cyberpunk 2077. Ray tracing can be enabled independently on any brand of RT-capable cards, no DLSS required. The same goes for path tracing, which is a much more intensive option that, if you watch our previous video, looks pretty good when it works well. Frame generation can be enabled independently on NVIDIA 40 series cards, no DLSS upscaling required, even though it's technically a DLSS feature. FrameGen also makes NVIDIA Reflex mandatory for this particular title, but we're not going to get into that today. Ray Reconstruction can be enabled on RT-capable NVIDIA cards only if DLSS upscaling is used and path tracing is enabled. That might change. We don't know. There's a lot of bugs in this menu right now, and it's possible that when they launch it, some of the stuff we're saying changes if they thought it was a bug. We asked about the upscaling requirement, and NVIDIA told us that, quote, we plan to add support for native resolution using DLAA. For now, though, NVIDIA has finally created a scenario where, on paper, DLSS can be said to be better than native. Now we're going to look at what Ray Reconstruction actually does in-game, and this requires some quick methodology notes. So, for this, all of the scenes we captured were done at 4K with an RTX 4090 and an i9 13900K. For our baseline settings, Ray Reconstruction was enabled, and DLSS was specifically and manually set to quality. This is important because NVIDIA's review guide for this recommends that DLSS is set to auto, which is completely insane, and we hope nobody took that advice because it introduces a gigantic variable into something that has both visual and performance implications. Accessing the Ray Reconstruction toggle at all requires starting from the RT Overdrive preset, so that's what we did, but with film grain, chromatic aberration, depth of field, lens flare, and motion blur turned off for comparison. DLAA, dynamic resolution scaling, and all non-DLSS forms of upscaling, so FSR, XESS, so forth, were disabled. DLSS frame generation is on by default as part of the RT Overdrive preset. We left it on for our baseline. All settings were kept at our baseline values for these clips unless we specifically noted otherwise. For the settings we'll refer to as native, all DLSS features were disabled, including upscaling, ray reconstruction, and frame generation. This is also what NVIDIA has used as a visual comparison against DLSS 3.5, as well as suggesting that reviewers use it for performance comparisons, and that isn't relevant or fair from a testing methodology standpoint. It's certainly beneficial, but our comparisons instead will focus on testing from our baseline settings that we just defined. And then what we're doing is basically just toggling ray reconstruction on and off under the settings we'll talk about later. The capture is just for visual comparison only, and so the capture itself, the video, is not for performance analysis. That's a separate thing in charts. The frame rates in our capture are not representative of the testing that we're going to be doing later, and we'll cover the performance separately in a moment. Finally, we encountered a ton of bugs in the menu system and applying graphic settings for this Cyberpunk build, at least for the press build. They are too numerous and boring to list, so the short version is we suggest you verify all of your graphic settings after changing presets, changing any individual setting also should be double checked, or even restarting the game. Actually, especially restarting the game can cause these problems. Applying changes doesn't always work. And you should also check them after running the built-in benchmark. We've found scenarios where you can change it before the benchmark, run it, find out at the end that it toggled DLSS settings. So they can reset after applying, before running the bench. They reset upon restarting the game sometimes. It's really buggy. Okay, into the testing. Our first example is driving. Ghosting behind car side mirrors was one of the NVIDIA provided examples of problems which should be solved by Ray Reconstruction. We found that we needed to stick close to its example to see the effect. The Porsche 911 moves quickly and has a dark side mirror that projects out from one side, which is ideal. Zooming in on the side mirror and watching it in motion reveals a streak behind it, too light or too dark, depending on the surrounding lighting. The effect is lessened by Ray Reconstruction, enough to make it less noticeable. The movement here is critical to really seeing this impact. The screenshot doesn't show it the same way. And this is a best case scenario. When we tried cars with smaller mirrors, which is most of them, there was less ghosting to begin with. Ray Reconstruction more significantly reduced ghosting on the taillight illumination on the road surface, but it still didn't eliminate it. Notice how the streak of red extends back from the car as soon as it starts moving. With or without Ray Reconstruction, there's also a dark streak that incorrectly trails behind the car as it passes under lights. But Ray Reconstruction does an excellent job of recreating sharp, car-shaped shadows to the side as it passes the gas station lights. Without Ray Reconstruction, these shadows are completely erased. Reconstruction also sharpens headlight-illuminated vegetation, seen most clearly at the beginning of the clip and the very end as the car veers off the road. In motion, the outlines of the headlight beams are more clearly defined with Reconstruction, where the beam passes over the grass and the gravel on the shoulder. As the car passes the gas station, we see some extremely prominent ghosting on the overhead streetlights that Ray Reconstruction does nothing to address. But on further inspection, this is due to just regular old DLSS. Running the game at native without DLSS features eliminates that problem. The native capture does show significant taillight and side mirror ghosting though, confirming that those are due to RT denoising. So far, Ray Reconstruction has at least done as well as the old denoisers in a straight A-B comparison, and at best, it's shown improvement. On to our next area, the overpass. In theory, reflections should be the simplest, most obvious comparison to make, but there's a reason we didn't start here. With Ray Reconstruction, the reflections on the sidewalk become sharper, most noticeable with the yellow barricade in the center and the garbage next to it. The thin, dark lines in the reflection of the barricade are the sort of detail that's lost without Reconstruction. The more noticeable effect is that the outlines of every speck of water and crack in the sidewalk are sharply lit with Ray Reconstruction, which leads to a kind of oil painting effect. One area of definite improvement is the oil drum and the pile of garbage under the road. This is an ideal use case for Ray Reconstruction, because the thin, dark shadows under the cardboard and oil drum are wiped away by the old denoisers, but they stay there with Ray Reconstruction. The next scene is on the sidewalk. Ray Reconstruction is visible here in the reflection of the rotating billboard on the wet sidewalk, with text and images more clearly defined. But there's also arguably an over-sharpening effect over the whole reflection. For Ray Reconstruction to have a clear win here, the puddle would need to fully cover the entire sidewalk and provide a completely smooth surface. Ray Reconstruction in our baseline recording also appears to cause heavier ghosting and smearing around distant cars and pedestrians at the far end of the sidewalk, directly in front of the camera. Examining our native recording without any DLSS features, the reflected rotating billboard is indeed blurrier than with Ray Reconstruction, so Reconstruction can help. There's also still ghosting and distortion around distant NPCs and cars in the native recording, so this should be an issue related to RT denoising that Ray Reconstruction could address, but it appears to make things worse here. We also recorded passes of the baked-in benchmark for comparison, but we noticed that the smoke effects in the bar and the alley varied heavily between scenes, even with identical settings. So the majority of the benchmark is invalid for visual comparison. Instead, we'll skip ahead to the portions that we can compare. As the camera flies over the puddle in the alley outside the bar, we see almost the reverse of the scenes that we've looked at so far. With Ray Reconstruction, the edges of the puddle are blurred and blended into the sidewalk texture. The reflections within the puddle are sharper with Reconstruction and contain less ghosting around the reflected objects. But Ray Reconstruction also introduces its own ghosting artifacts behind the dark cracks on the sidewalk. We noticed one prominent bug that we replicated across multiple recordings, alongside the other issues with just the graphics settings changing in general. But this specific bug was with the palm trees. As the palm trees in the final portion of the bench draw nearer to the camera and load higher detail models, the trunks blink in much darker than they should be, and then they fade back to a normal color. This only happens when Ray Reconstruction is enabled, and it happens to every tree in the scene. We also recorded some footage with DLSS set to ultra performance, as opposed to the quality setting that we used for the rest of our capture. NVIDIA has stated that it has a, quote, plan to train DLSS Ray Reconstruction to support ultra performance, so presumably that means this isn't ready for prime time yet, but it can still be enabled. Based on this footage, we wouldn't recommend it right now. Ray Reconstruction serves to highlight the low source resolution, like with the palm trees shimmering here. With Ray Reconstruction on, this bright club scene is less blown out by the sheer number of lights present in the scene. With it off, it's all super bright, and makes certain things look flatter, like the AC unit on the top right. We made note of this in our previous RT Overdrive video as well, and it's still hard to say which one is more realistic, since the entire ceiling is covered in lights. This kind of comes down to personal preference. However, we think the new Ray Reconstruction looks better in general here. The added depth from shadows and various creases and crevices we think looks better, and the shiny couches look sharper and less hazy than with it turned off. There's also another instance of gritty detail being wiped out though. The nearest couch is supposed to have some dirt or wear on it, but it's mostly gone with Ray Reconstruction enabled. Moving on to this bar scene, baseline with Ray Reconstruction looks sharper, as seen in all the foliage and the bottles on the shelf just inside the window. It's also generally shinier, like in the tops of the kegs behind the bar and in the taps on the right side. The reflections themselves are better, like on the counter under the bottle shelf and the bartender's hand. With Ray Reconstruction on, several objects look more grounded in the scene, like in the ashtray, the bottles, and the glasses on the near bar. The bartender's clothes also have more depth, with shadow under his collar and more definition in the sleeve of his shirt. In the background and just over his shoulder, there's more detail in the other building's interior with Ray Reconstruction on. It's not all good though. We noticed some gritty and worn detail on the metallic bar stools disappearing with Ray Reconstruction on, as if it thinks it's getting rid of noise or something, when in reality that's actually supposed to be there. This next scene with the red car has a good mix of near and far elements. First off, ignore the terrible reflection in the car's window. It looked like that no matter what we did. Baseline with Ray Reconstruction again looks sharper and shinier. We think it looks good on the shelter to the left side of the screen. The highlights on the roof are brighter, and the lantern in particular looks better to us. The overall effect can be too much though. Looking at the front fender area shows us the much improved reflections, but also the extremely sharp highlights on edges in a way that looks like it's trying too hard. Moving to the car's door, we can also see the metallic flakes in the paint turn into bright points of glittery light with Ray Reconstruction turned on. One last thing to point out is that heat haze effect over the fire. Without Ray Reconstruction, we see lots of shimmering and warping over the flames, but with it turned on, that behavior is almost entirely wiped out. Up next is the float. The Arasaka parade scene is one of our favorites in the game. Ray Reconstruction gives the whole float a more golden color from the numerous lights on board. There's more light on the underside of the roof, and the big metal chicken picks up a lot of reflections. Speaking of reflections, we again see more detail in the reflections around the edge of the float, more accurately showing the wood paneling and flags above it. While most of our examples show increased depth and definition, the triangular area on the side above the awning appears much flatter and muddier with Ray Reconstruction on. Once the float passes, the buildings in the background show observably more contrast and sharpness. Finally, the firework of the Arasaka logo appears much brighter with Ray Reconstruction on, with the individual points of light blooming to a much higher degree than with it off. In this server room, we see a mixture of good and bad from Ray Reconstruction. Ignore the glitch effect on the player's hand, that's intentional and part of the game. Edges throughout the scene pop out more with the feature turned on, and the reflection in the floor is sharper. One of the more annoying negative effects is the smearing around the trailing edges of the player's gun model. It's present in both, but we think it's worse with Ray Reconstruction on. On the positive side, Reconstruction cleans up the rolling shimmering effect of the thin horizontal lines in the floor at the left side and middle right of the screen, and it adds a shadow under the dropped gun. The rapidly flickering light above Atom Smasher is the same with or without Reconstruction. It seems to be an artifact of DLSS itself. as it's not present in the native recording. And now we get an interesting one. It's the same scene, but with motion added in. Without Ray Reconstruction, the reflections on the floor become extremely grainy as the denoiser fails to compensate for motion. With Ray Reconstruction enabled though, and this is where it's supposed to be stronger, the reflections remain smooth even as the camera moves side to side. There's still a visible boiling effect in the wake of the gun and hand models, and there's additional ghosting behind dark lines on the floor, but we think this is definitely preferable to the alternative. Now we're going to get into some of the bugs. So for our visual analysis, we focused on finding good and repeatable scenes that would show the benefits, if any, or the downsides of Ray Reconstruction. In the process of recording the footage, though, we came across a few issues. We're categorizing these separately because they have less to do with visual fidelity and more to do with being straight up broken. We noticed some areas where transparent items became partially invisible with Ray Reconstruction enabled. The most obvious example is this fast travel point, where chunks of the hologram above it disappear. Keep an eye on the left side of the hologram, especially as we start moving. The effect is really noticeable in game, and fast travel points are extremely common, but the bug only manifests with certain surroundings. Looking at the same sign, we can see trails of light smeared over the fence behind the sign as we walk towards it. Again, this bug disappears when Ray Reconstruction is disabled. For a more obvious example, we can look at the warning lights on this rooftop. They do leave small trails with Ray Reconstruction off, but the trails become ridiculously long with the setting enabled. As we already mentioned, we saw some LOD-related lighting bugs in the built-in benchmark scene. We saw this elsewhere as well, like the roof of this shack, and there's some visible pop-in with Ray Reconstruction off, but with it on, there are giant flickering black areas over the roof as we get near to it. Finally, there's an ongoing issue with ray tracing looking extremely bright after loading a save or exiting a menu. This one isn't due to Ray Reconstruction. It happens with even all DLSS features disabled, but it's one of the most common graphical bugs remaining in the game. The faster the game is running, the faster the lighting is calculated, and the less severe this effect will be. Also, if CDPR is listening, please fix the settings menu that we talked about earlier. Individual settings get reset constantly for inscrutable reasons. We've had situations where we've applied settings, clicked run benchmark in the settings menu, then the settings at the end of the bench were different from the ones that we'd set at the start. It's extremely difficult to have confidence that the settings are ever what they say they are. That's a CDPR issue though. On to performance. Performance is quick for this one. DLSS is a separate test, as is frame generation, and we've looked at both of these things in the past. Our focus is only on one thing today, Ray Reconstruction, tested under conditions with frame generation off or on. In this quick set of benchmarks, we have 4 entries. In the frame generation on test, we see Ray Reconstruction technically had an uplift for performance. There's a reason for this, we'll get to that. Frame generation off testing and on testing had similar results here, where Ray Reconstruction technically is gaining. So for one of them, we see an 8.6% advancement. The other one, we see 8.5% with Ray Reconstruction on. It's remarkably consistent between the FG options. As for why, our best bet is that this has to do with the denoisers. Speaking with NVIDIA, this behavior is expected sometimes, like in Cyberpunk, but not always. In other words, it's possible that certain configurations, test areas, or most likely just other games could have slightly negative results from Ray Reconstruction being on. In this particular test, the removal of Cyberpunk's multiple denoisers for Ray Reconstruction instead is leading to a net positive performance advantage. However, we really want to stress this. Other games may show performance cost, but this particular execution benefits. Now, RT denoising flaws exist regardless of whether upscaling is used or occurs. NVIDIA almost seems invested in implying that ray tracing, frame generation, Ray Reconstruction, and DLSS upscaling all go in one big bucket. And to be fair, AMD also sort of implies this, but just to demystify things a little bit, that's not necessarily the case. Upscaling is not inherently part of RT. Upscaling does, however, do something interesting. A couple things, actually. One, obviously it makes RT more usable at a playable frame rate, but 2, it also amplifies the flaws of existing denoising solutions, a lot of which are manually tuned, often by game developers, to work for a specific game. And this creates a greater need for something like Ray Reconstruction to try and then patch up those flaws that were left behind by a solution that makes the frame rate more playable while the game theoretically looks better. Now, fewer pixels at the true render resolution means fewer rays, and fewer samples for the denoisers to work with. So that's sort of the source of that. All told then, this is pretty simple as a feature. First of all, there shouldn't be a big performance impact for this one, if there is a performance impact. In this particular instance, as we talked about, there's actually performance uplift. That's going to vary game by game, but in either situation, it doesn't seem like it should cost that much from a performance standpoint. In general, we think it looks the same or better. And there are instances where it looks worse, but it's never that much worse. Again, not with this game. It'll probably vary a little bit game to game. This is basically a free, but minor in some cases, upgrade. So from that perspective, it's pretty inoffensive. It's the same or better in most cases. It can look better than native sometimes just because of how the combination of Ray Reconstruction works with all these other technologies. And in the worst case, if you don't like it, don't turn it on. Now, comparing versus native isn't valid. There's really only a couple ways to test this properly in a true A/B comparison. We did that for you. We don't agree with NVIDIA's review guide. We typically don't read them, but in this instance, there were so many bugs that we looked at it. So at the end of the day, we think that, once again, the overall uplift is positive to the same for most instances. And I asked Patrick, who did the most work on capturing and writing for this piece, asked him, because he plays Cyberpunk, when you go home and play Cyberpunk, will you enable Ray Reconstruction? Does this add value to you? He has a 4090 at home, so I asked, and he said yes, he would enable Ray Reconstruction. So I think that's about our technology review for you for this one. And maybe we'll look at it if it comes along for another interesting game. Phantom Liberty is on our radar next for Cyberpunk. That's a separate embargo, of course, and we'll be benchmarking that one probably. But otherwise, check back for all of our additional coverage coming up. You can go see our Starfield stuff if you want to check out DLSS in mod format with frame generation in Starfield. And as always, thank you for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab one of our new mod mats that are on the store, or you go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw us a few bucks to support our testing efforts. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.